Okay, if people will come in and be settled, we'll get started. We're going to get started in just a moment. Okay, good morning everyone. I'm John Curran. I'm the President and CEO of ARIN, the American Registry for Internet Numbers. And today we're going to have a public policy consultation at NANOG. So I'd like to tell you what exactly that is. It's where we hold a discussion here to get input for developing policies for use for number resource administration. It is in person and facilitated by remote participation. We have scribes set up, and we hold these at ARIN public policy meetings and other forums like NANOG as approved by the ARIN board. So today's agenda, we're going to give you an update on the ARIN Advisory Council activities, and then we're going to go through three policies: recommended draft policy 2013-4, RIR principles, draft policy 2013-6, allocation of IPv4 and IPv6 address space to out-of-region requesters, and draft policy ARIN 2013-7, merging IPv4, ISP, and end-user requirements. Welcome our remote participants. We have a webcast of this. There's a live transcript. You can download the meeting materials, which includes the discussion guide that we're all holding here. There's a chat room online where you can participate in the virtual microphone and participate in the show of hands. Rules and reminders. Okay, simple courtesies. The chair, in this case Vice Chair Paul Anderson, will moderate the discussion of the draft policy so everyone can speak and everyone can be heard. State your name and affiliation when you're recognized at the mic. Please comply with the rules and courtesies in the discussion guide. Okay, at the head table, Paul Anderson, Vice Chair and Treasurer, myself, Chris Grunderman of the RNAC, Chris Grunderman, RNAC, Dave Farmer over here, Scott Librand over here, and John Sweeting right here. Okay. And this is, I'll be the staff representative. Paul will moderate the discussion. John is the chair, obviously, and our AC members are going to be talking about the various policy proposals. So, first one is update on Advisory Council activities. John Sweeting, AC Chair.
All right, good morning, everyone. I also would like to recognize Rob Seastrom on the far end down there running the jabber. Well, he wasn't on the list. Okay. He snuck up. All right, good morning. So, update on Advisory Council activities. So, at the current time, there are no proposals on our docket, and we have three draft policies. One is a recommended draft, and the other two are just regular draft policies. The difference being the recommended draft can be sent to last call following these meetings this week. Part of what the AC does and what we need your feedback on to help us determine what to do with these draft policies and what the next step is for each one of them is we need your feedback to help us figure out if they're fair, technically sound, and supported by you, the community, and EINR. At the AC meeting on Friday, we're going to be taking all that feedback and evaluating the three policies. So I said the recommended draft policy for the RIR principles, that will be eligible to go to last call. Of course, there's other things that can happen to it. It can be abandoned, it can be left on the docket, where then it can be petitioned to go to last call or abandoned after, I think, 60 days. But don't quote me on that. Check the PDP. And then the two draft policies, the allocation of IPv4 and IPv6 to outer region is still in progress and would have to go to another meeting before it could go to last call, and it would have to be promoted to a recommended draft policy before that. Next meeting being the PPC at NANOG in February. And the same thing with the draft policy ARIN 2013-7, merging IPv4 ISP and end user requirements. That is also a work in process, which also can do any of the same things I just mentioned about the other draft policy. That's all the slides I have, but I would like to take a second to remind everybody that the ARIN elections are happening this week, and the AC will have 5 of the positions open for the election. And I'd also like to, at this time, congratulate Chris Grunderman on his recent move over to the Internet Society, and thank him for his 3 years on the AC because he has chosen not to run again. So, do what?
No.
Now you can clap. Okay, and then for all the other stuff that the election, who's running, the nominees and everything is all, you can find that all on the ARIN site. And please go to the ARIN site, check it out, check out their bios, and also if you support any of those currently running, please leave a statement of support for them prior to the elections. Thank you. Oh, any questions, I guess? I'll answer them. No questions?
Any questions for John? No? Thank you, John. Okay, so we're now going to cover the first policy. This is a recommended draft policy. Recommended draft policies have been deemed by the Advisory Council to meet the requirements of good policy. They may be sent to the board for adoption after public policy consultation. This means a recommended draft policy is potentially a very soon new future policy, something worth considering. And so the one that we're talking about today is 2013-4, RIR Principles. It originated in April 2013 as Proposition 187. The AC Shepherds are Chris Grunderman, Kathy Aronson, and Owen DeLong. It was accepted as a draft policy in May. This was presented at NANOG 58 at another ARIN PPC. It was revised in July and August. The staff assessment was prepared in September. The AC recommended adoption in September, and it is online and in your discussion guide. Staff summary, it adds text to the NRPM, which codifies guiding principles of the registry system as registration, conservation, routability, and stewardship. There's a new status at other RIRs. There's a new similar proposal at LACNIC, principles governing distribution of number resources, LAC 21302. Purpose, to group the principles governing the distribution of internet number resources in a single initial paragraph. You can see it online here. Staff assessment. Staff notes the proposal does not appear to exchange any existing staff processes or procedures. Inclusion in the policy manual will make it more clear to the community the principles under which we've operated. We note that registration, conservation, and routability already exist in the NRPM, but the term stewardship is new for the number resource policy manual. Note that the ARIN PDP contains the following. Principles of Internet Number Resource Policy. Internet Resource Policy must satisfy 3 important principles, specifically fair and impartial number resource administration, technically sound, and supported by the community. Additionally, there are principles in RFC 7020 which refer to allocation pool management, hierarchical allocation, and registration accuracy. So both our policy development process and IETF RFC 7020 have some principles that may be applicable or overlap. Minimal impact, updated guidelines and staff training. Legal assessment does not create a material legal issue for ARIN. Any effort to accurately incorporate in writing the concepts that animate ARIN's activity is a positive development. PPML discussion. No comments since being recommended for adoption. The earlier comments include comments such as all 3 previous principles must be balanced with one another, and stewardship is the principle which informs that act. Don't call it stewardship, call it what you just called it, balance. Better yet, crib from NRPM 638 and tell us how to weigh the 3 principles. Is this intended to be a global policy? So that's some of the comments on the list and the staff introduction. I'll now turn it over to the AC to do the policy presentation. Who's got it? Go, Chris. Go ahead.
Thank you. Excuse me. Yeah, so as John indicated, I just want to talk a little bit about what ARIN 2013 is. A clear definition of the common principles and goals which guide our community was the intent here. Obviously placing those into the NRPM so that they can be owned by the community, and that also provides an established change process where we understand how to change policy within the ARIN region. And so these are placed there where they're easy to get to, where it's very clear what they are, and then in the future we can also move forward if we need to. The principles as defined are registration, conservation, routability, and stewardship. So starting with registration and routability, there seems to be pretty wide consensus on both of these, both on what they mean and on the fact that they're needed. So registration is basically the database entry itself to ensure uniqueness of the number space, and routability then is handing out address space in a way that allows for a scalable routed internet. Not necessarily guaranteeing routability, but helping as much as possible. So one of the conversations that came up was around conservation and what that means and if that's the right term. And so I wanted to start with just a little kind of plain language, English language definition of what conservation means. And here from dictionary.com you can see prevention of injury, decay, waste, or loss, the careful utilization of a natural resource in order to prevent depletion. And then from the Science Dictionary, I think it's fairly clear, it says the protection, preservation, management, or restoration of natural environments. And so on, and I think that can be applied to a public environment such as IP space or ASN numbers just as well. The kind of counter argument was that sustainability was a better term, so I wanted to look at the definition of that here as well. So sustainability says the ability to be sustained, supported, upheld, or confirmed, and sustainable is capable of being somehow supported or upheld as having its weight borne from below. So if we look at the two. Whoops, going the wrong way. It's going backwards. Sorry about that. So we look at the two together, right? The objection was that because the free pool of IPv4 is depleted, that conservation is no longer the wrong term. You can't conserve anything because it's gone, and that now we're looking at sustainability. And I think the response that I've seen is that sustainability is actually more of a property of a resource, whereas conservation is the activity of providing sustainability. And so they're not really opposing viewpoints, they're kind of orthogonal and different meanings. And so conservation still seems to be the right principle to include and the right word to use. And then the couple more notes that were made was that we're not conserving the free pool, so whether or not the IPv4 free pool is empty, not to mention the fact that we're also talking about ASNs and IPv6, which have lots of free addresses left, or free numbers left. But we're not protecting just the free pool, we're protecting the number space as a whole. And so, you know, the free pool was actually a buffer against abuse in the past. So if somebody was hoarding addresses or using addresses in a malicious way, there was a safety valve to allow more addresses out into the internet. And so once that free pool rolls up, conservation actually becomes even more important in a lot of people's view. And then finally, just the statement that IP addresses are a public good, and so stewardship kind of requires conservation, which is protection, preservation, and management of that resource. The other word that came up in the last comments was stewardship, and whether or not stewardship was what we really meant there. Again, dictionary.com says it's the responsible overseeing and protection of something considered worth caring for and preserving. And so I think that sounds like exactly what ARIN, both the organization and ARIN, us, the community, is doing with number resources. So within 2013-4, stewardship becomes the overarching principle that kind of guides and both allows for and requires flexibility in balancing the other three principles. Those principles need to be balanced differently for each resource type. Our IPv4, IPv6, and AS numbers are all somewhat different, so there's some trade-offs there. And each unique situation is a little bit different. And so, you know, aside from the principle of stewardship, there's a whole lot of detail of how to actually effectively meet these principles, and that's what the entire NRPM is for, right? Specific policy for specific situations, whereas these are just the general top-level principles. So one thing to point out here is that we're not changing any principles with this policy. The idea here behind this proposal when it was submitted and the conversation that's gone on the list since then is that this is putting the principles in a place that's easy to find, that provides clarity to the community as to what those principles are. And again, per the staff assessment, this doesn't change any practice at ARIN, right? This actually isn't an operational change required by these. It's just defining the principles themselves in a clear and easily findable place, and also a place that's owned by the community, rather than outside of it in the PDP or in an RFC somewhere. It's actually in the NRPM, which is this community's document. Also, if the principles need to be changed over time, right, that's something that can be addressed separately once they're defined and clearly marked as they are today, right? So we define the principles as they are today, and then in the future we can come back and it actually becomes easier to change them if needed. With that, I want to pause, and again, in response to some of the comments on the list and from the staff assessment, there's a couple of changes that we'd like to propose after this meeting, because we're in text-free, so we couldn't make them before the meeting. One is around the question of whether or not it's a global policy. It was suggested that we change Internet Registry System in the title of the policy to ARIN itself, right? Because these policies are obviously specific to ARIN, and so that's something that we'd like some feedback after this meeting on that change. And then also the example within stewardship, instead of staff report, so that might be unnecessary and better handled within the specific IPv4, IPv6, and ASN sections, which probably need to be cleaned up after this is put in place anyway. So with those two changes, that's what we'd like to discuss.
So our Vice Chair, Paul Anderson, will moderate the discussion. The microphones are open.
The microphones are indeed open, and I know it's lovely early in the morning, but if this policy, the AC is looking to see that there's a clear community consensus, so we can only do that if you approach the microphone, state your name, your organization, and whether or not you're in favor or against, and then any other comments you'd like to make. Center mic.
Captain Gruber, Dwyer, and AC, I'm in support of this proposal. I've read it a lot, I've seen the discussion a lot, and when you were talking about it, especially about the dictionary definitions, it sort of tweaked, not twerked, tweaked, that...
Oh, the visual.
Thank you. What I realized was each definition from the dictionary has multiple bullet points as what they could be. You put 3 people in a room, and 3 people will pick 3 different bullet points. Over time, those bullet points change, their meanings change, how people interpret them change, and it becomes sort of a sliding thing that you go from one word to one of its examples to how that person perceives that example. And my only suggestion would be possibly adding in the specific definition to the, in the case
Into
of
the policy
stewardship,
text
into
itself?
the policy text itself, to not have any ambiguity as to which of the specific meanings you have.
Chris, any thoughts on
Yeah, I
that?
think that's fair. One thing I just want to ask you some feedback. If you advance one slide or 2 slides, Paul, there's actually the, so in the last version of the text, right, the first sentence in each one of the 4 sections provides what would be the NRPM definition of each of these words. So what these words mean specifically for the NRPM. So it's not the broad, full level definition, but like in this case, the principle of registration guarantees the uniqueness of internet number resources. So that's what really we're talking about, right? So registration is about guaranteeing the uniqueness of number resources. And if you go on to the next slide real quick, conservation guarantees sustainability in the internet through efficient utilization of unique number. So we tried to do that somewhat. I know it's not quite a full definition, but does that meet your needs, or would you see something additional?
The more, again, just hearing you talk about the way, and the way I'm seeing it, I'm concerned that a word like sustainability will be twisted over time, and this wonderful discussion that we're having today will not translate 5 years from now, or will get morphed 5 years from now. This is meant to be a long-term goal change, not change, but right up.
Thank you for the feedback. Again, center microphone.
Owen DeLong, you're an AC Hurricane Electric. I support the policy. I do think that adding a few keywords that are ambiguous to Section 2 would be a potential improvement, as long as we don't go too far overboard with defining every word to be an RPM. But in general, I support the policy as is, and I would support with the addition of definitions.
Thank you, Owen. I'd ask you again, I know it's you don't want to all rush the microphones at once. Could you please, if you wish to even it's simple enough just to say I'm in favor or against. You don't need to make any comments, but the AC is looking for clear feedback on whether or not there's community support. So I'd encourage you to approach the microphone now or start typing remotely if you wish. And Mr.
And
RS will.
preferably from people other than the AC.
Well, I wasn't going to say it, but.
But I will, because that's what I want.
Again, this policy will be soon going to, potentially be considered by the AC for last call.
Silence for taking this.
I'd also be really, really interested in anybody's comments that isn't going to be here for the follow-on ARIN meeting. This is your opportunity to let us know what you think.
Are you approaching the microphone, sir, or just taking a walk? It's hard to tell. He's going to the microphones. Whenever you're ready, sir.
I'm Andrew Sullivan. I work for Dine. The mic back there has a big echo, so I came up here.
Okay.
So, I mean, I guess I support this policy. The truth is, my real reaction to it is meh. I don't see a big advantage to it. It codifies a number of principles. Whenever you start to codify principles, of course, then this is a massive opportunity for later arguments about principles, and that's actually my biggest concern about it. That this is a denial of service for some future policy development, just sitting here waiting to go off under our feet in the future. That's really my only reservation, but apart from that, the principles seem fine.
So a meh supportive, but supportive. Thank you, sir. Next gentleman.
Mike Joseph, Google. I support this policy. I think it does an important job to capture these guiding principles for the policy work we do, particularly in light of the changes to 2050. So I think we should move forward and advance this policy as is so that we can capture them now.
Thank you, sir. Yeah. Any remote comments, RS?
If I can turn this on. No remote comments yet.
No remote comments. Good. Is there anybody who may want, most of the comments so far have been in favor. Is there someone who might want to speak against or give any reason why the AC might not want to advance this policy? If you wish to approach the microphones, I ask you to do it rapidly, as I'm getting that look that it is almost time to close the microphones. Going once, twice, start typing quickly on the remote if you're closed in the room. Someone is typing, RS? Seeing none, then we will call that closed, and I will at this time ask, it's now audience participation time, and that we would like to take a poll of those who in this room, and if you can hear the sound of my voice, you are allowed to vote, so please do. I'm going to ask first for those who are in favor of the proposal as written and those who are opposed to the proposal as written. So I will first just look for a sign that our counters are ready and armed. Oh, I see the thumbs up. So online, please vote now, and those in the room, if you are in favor of the proposal as written, please raise your arm high, keep it up. Stretch break. I'm going to do this 3 times so you can practice both, arms. Okay, you can put your hands down. Those opposed to the policy as written, could you please raise your hand nice and high? Going once, twice, 3 times. Thank you. If you'll just give a moment, our crack team of tabulators are Richard Jimison is delivering the results, a recent return to ARIN. Thank you. The envelope, please. On the matter of 2013-4, all those in favor, 28, against, 0. Total number of people in the room, both in the room and remote, 80. This feedback is being provided to the AC as we speak for their consideration. Thank you.
Okay. Next policy to be discussed is a draft policy. Draft Policy 2013-6, allocation of IPv4 and IPv6 address space to out-of-region requesters. Originated as ARIN Policy Proposal 189 in May 2013, the Shepherds, David Farmer, Bill Dart, and Milton Mueller. Accepted as a draft policy in June, revised September. The staff assessment came out, it was revised again, and it is online and in your discussion guide. The policy would require requesters to provide proof of legal presence within the ARIN region and to demonstrate that a majority or plurality of their technical infrastructure and customers are within the ARIN region in order to qualify and receive IPv4 and IPv6 resources. Status at other RIRs. In AFRINIC resources are for AFRINIC service region, and any use outside the region should be solely supported connectivity back to the AFRINIC region. APNIC, no specific policy text. In LACNIC, there's a proposal, principles governing distribution of number resources. The numbering resources under stewardship of LACNIC must be distributed among organizations legally constituted in its service region and mainly serving networks and services operating in the region. External clients connected directly to main infrastructure located in the region are allowed. RIPE, membership is open without conditions. Staff assessment, legal assessment of the 4 September version. Formalizes ARIN's existing practices with respect to requiring the request to have a legal presence in the ARIN region and to operate a network in the region. Would it create a new practice and processes via inclusion of the statement, a plurality of resources requested from ARIN must be justified by technical infrastructure and customers located within the ARIN service region. This could create a scenario where a network cannot get IPv4 or v6 addresses from any RIR, since we would require plurality, and it's possible, depending on your network distribution, you wouldn't qualify for a new allocation from any RIR. Unclear on how the location of hosting customers is defined. The customers in one place, the servers in another place. If it's a virtual server, that's where the problem may come up because the virtual server doesn't have a physical presence. There are potential implications with respect to IPv6 in the proposed policy text. In particular, does the community want an organization to get all the space from one RIR when it comes from IPv6? So that was the staff assessment. Legal assessment does fill an important gap in ARIN's policies. It provides policy guidance that clearly describes the degree to which a proposed recipient of number resources from ARIN has to real installations and customers in the region. From a legal standpoint, we want to avoid the extremes, so we don't want to have inadequate policy guidance that would leave it subject to staff interpretation, but we don't also want to have overly prescriptive guidance. So in the middle is a good place, and this seems to be in the middle. In particular, the current text, the plurality of resources requested from ARIN must be justified by technical infrastructure or customers in the ARIN service region. Should be carefully evaluated. It sets a policy requirement of plurality that may be unnecessarily restrictive in some cases. A lower standard is recommended to otherwise avoid valid requesters for address resources from being precluded from obtaining number resources. Note the policy language which provides reasonable restrictions meaning a real presence and clear intention to make use of the resources within the region can be adopted without creating a serious legal risk. Kind of a long review, but policies that create circumstances for ARIN to say no tend to get longer legal assessments than others. Work in progress. This is still ongoing, so we're really talking about what improvements can be made or if it's ready to go. It's been posted to PPML and presented for community discussion, of which there's been a bit. Is it fair and impartial? Is it technically sound? Is it supported by the community? We will do a staff and legal review once we get the next revised version from the AC. Recent discussion. Let me see how recent this is. Relatively recent discussion. Plurality is precisely defined mathematical concept. The part I have a problem with is a network located within the ARIN service region. As far as law enforcement agencies are concerned, the problem is not so much a question of depletion of IPv4 pool, but traceability. Maybe ARIN's policy should be consistent regarding the allocation of both v4 and v6 addresses, requesting that stakeholders have sufficient attachment to the region prior to receiving addresses from ARIN. And ARIN 2013-6 would be a change to existing policy. It would make clear that customer growth in region would be necessary to justify requests, where presently we have some folks requesting research resources using nominal equipment within the region and backed by extensive customer growth external to the region. Okay, that concludes the staff introduction of the policy. I'm now going to bring up the AC to speak to it.
Okay, so let's start out with just a quick discussion of what the problem is. And as John mentioned earlier, right now the existing operational practices are fundamentally based on Section 2.2's definition of a regional internet registry. This really isn't a policy, this is simply a definition of what an RIR is. But it's the only thing that staff really has any guidance in the NRPM to create its practices. And so there's, really no clear policy that defines who's eligible to receive resources from ARIN and under what conditions. Do we want to fix that? For the most part, the intent is to formalize existing operational practice, but as we've gone through the discussion, I'm not going to say that it's clear we don't have consensus, but it's not obvious to me as somebody who's paying close attention that we have clear consensus for the operational practices. Otherwise, I think this discussion would be pretty easy. As I've pointed out on the list, and on the list there's actually a video clip with a timestamp reference. A lot of people think that, and I think mistakenly think, that they can't use ARIN resources outside of the region. But there's nothing in policy that clearly states this one way or the other. And it's not a stretch to interpret Section 2.2 as saying you can't. So the current text, what I'll just read here real quickly, but it's on the screen and in your discussion guides. Organizations requesting internet number resources from ARIN must provide proof that they, 1, are an active business entity legally operating within the ARIN service region, and 2, are operating a network located in the ARIN service region. In addition to all other applicable policy requirements, a plurality of new resources requested from ARIN must be justified by technical infrastructure or customers located within the ARIN service region, and any located outside the ARIN, any located outside the region must be interconnected to the ARIN service region. The same technical infrastructure or customers cannot be used to justify resources in more than one RIR. Okay, so there's really 4 major parts to this policy: the presence in the region, some amount more than a trivial amount of resources must be justified from within the region, a plurality. Something we're going to talk about is, should that be lowered to a minimum percentage? And then there's out-of-region use is explicitly allowed. It's clear now that you can use resources out of the region, but there's some requirements about infrastructure being interconnected, et cetera, and that there's a plurality of it inside. The same customers or infrastructure cannot be used to justify overlapping requests. Okay, so let's talk in detail about the presence within the region. There's really 2 parts to this, the sort of legal operation and then a network. Current operational practice is the business entity needs to be formed within the region. This relaxes that to any business entity legally operating within the region. So this would mean a entity formed in another RIR's region can get ARIN resources for use in the region, etc. This was a concern that was raised. This, I feel, addresses that concern. And then you need to be operating a network in the ARIN service region. I think it's kind of self-explanatory. If you're not operating network in the ARIN region, what are you doing asking ARIN for resources? So out-of-region use, the policy explicitly allows out-of-region use. The current lack of clear policy here is unclear and confusing. I got to revise that. Clear and unclear in the same sentence isn't good. Okay. Many people, as I said before, many people assume they can only use ARIN resources within the ARIN region, even if this is not the technically superior solution for them or the internet as a whole. A number of people in the example I asked, provided on the list, there's a number of people saying, can they get IPv6 for their global enterprise, and do they have to get resources from all 5 RIRs? Well, this would mean you'd have to have 5 prefixes when one might do. That's going to create some routability issues eventually. Out of the region, and the outer region should be interconnected to the region. The idea here is discrete networks in another region should use that region. In other words, it's not connected to the ARIN region, they should use resources from the other RIR. Overlapping requests. This is fairly self-explanatory, but there are some corner cases that were brought up on the list. One of them is here. Basically, the intent here isn't to prevent a web server or router, some sort of technical infrastructure from having addresses from 2 different RIRs. This is obviously going to be necessary in some cases from a router perspective. And so we're not trying to get too locked down here. So some help with this language would be very useful to me. So here's the key question I think we have in front of us. The current language uses a plurality. I have problems with that word. And it requires that basically more of the ARIN issued resources are used within the ARIN region than in any other region. But there could be a total of more ARIN resources used outside the region. Then the other option would be a minimum percentage. This would relax that a little bit and would require a more than trivial amount of ARIN resources used within the ARIN region. 20% seems reasonable. This just comes from, that would be the smallest plurality you could have. But this would mean you could have more resources in another RIR than you're using in the ARIN region. I know some people have problems with that. I personally don't, but. So a couple other issues. Current operational practice is that individuals cannot receive allocations or assignments. Is this what we want? There was some questions of that on the list. There's no intent for this to be retroactive. The AC comments in the AC comments section, this is made clear, and just calling it out here. And the policy has no intent to require an overall plurality, but to it's how new requests are justified. I think this actually addresses one of the staff comments, but and so, like I said, the big question is plurality versus minimum percentage. And if we do minimum percentage, what's the right one? I've highlighted 20. Your thoughts? Ready for discussion.
Vice Chair Paul Anderson will moderate the discussion.
Thank you. So yes, this is a draft policy, so the AC and the Shepherds are looking for any input that might be useful and whether or not you think in general this is a good idea to be pursuing or not. So once again, please approach the microphones or the remote participation, and we'll start with center microphone, please.
David Huberman, Microsoft Corporation. All right, so I don't think that's the big question. Okay. And I think the reason, I completely agree with what you said at the beginning, which is you don't have a good feel for whether or not there's consensus or lack of consensus. But I think the reason is because we're discussing the wrong thing. In 1997, ARIN was formed, right? And from 97 to about a year or maybe a year and a half ago, this wasn't an issue. And the reason this wasn't an issue is if you operated a network in the US or Canada or the Caribbean, you came to ARIN. If you operated it in the Netherlands or Germany, you went to RIPE. If you operated it in Asia Pacific, you went to APNIC. It was all very clean and very easy. But then APNIC ran out of addresses. They will move to their /8 policy. And that makes things very difficult for the growing economies which exist in APNIC. The genesis of this policy proposal comes from staff experience, which states that organizations in the Asia Pacific region are petitioning ARIN for addresses for use primarily and in some cases exclusively by customers located in Asia Pacific with equipment mostly located in Asia Pacific who are using routing tricks to get around some of the rules that the ARIN staff had created to try and keep the registry system fair. So the question is, if you're an ARIN region network, do you want the addresses, the 2/8s of IPv4 addresses that are available to you today to remain available to you as an operator in this region, or do you want them to go to the next network in line, regardless of where they're located? Because the folks in Asia Pacific are coming over and taking significant amounts of addresses. I believe Mr. Curran posted to the list the other day, ARIN has fulfilled 52 requests of more than a /11. That's an eighth of a 2 million addresses. It's an eighth of a /8. And they're going to keep coming. We all know that. The economies there are growing fantastic. So, bottom line, are the addresses that are available in the V4 free address pool, are they for ARIN region customers, or are we agnostic to that issue, and are they for whoever needs them? The policy on the table isn't perfect, but I support it in principle. It needs some wordsmithing. I have full confidence in the AC to take care of the wordsmithing.
So you said we were asking the wrong question, though. So you're not supportive of the policy, but you're...
I just stated I'm in full support of the policy.
Right.
It has some wordsmithing
Okay.
issues. And the AC has my full confidence that those wordsmithing issues will be taken care of.
Thank you, then. Any comment? Go to the, don't see anything side, so next in the center. You're making it easy for me.
Andrew Bell, speaking for myself. I do not support the policy as written. I do not support the inclusion of the plurality statement or any sort of percentage. I support only the inclusion of the legal entity within the service region being put into policy. I don't think it's our duty at this point to stop RIR shopping because it's going to happen regardless of how many hurdles we throw up. So let's provide services to legal entities in the ARIN region, and at this point, this policy or this issue will, I believe, likely go away once ARIN runs out as well.
So you're supportive of the problem trying to be solved, but you wouldn't solve it the way that has been, you'd want that text revised to
That's correct.
take out the...
all the plurality and the network requirements problem.
Right?
So, before you run away, hold on a second. One of the pieces I put in the early part of what's the problem is it's not clear anywhere in the NRPM whether you can use ARIN resources in region or out of region. I think that's a problem.
I do not believe that's a problem. We should not be telling networks where they should be or shouldn't be using the address space. If they're a legal entity in the ARIN service region and wish to obtain address services from our region, then they should be permitted to do so and operate their networks as they see fit.
The problem I see with it is that a bunch of people are making an incorrect assumption that they can't use them out of region. I think a little bit of guidance that it's perfectly okay to use them outside of region is in order.
I think if you want to put that in policy, that's different than having it in a best practice or something else. Maybe that's a better place for that type of information.
Thank you for your comment. I'm going to go to a remote participant next.
We have a question from Frank Balk. Actually, we have two questions.
Okay.
The first question is, this proposal was drafted by law enforcement. Does the proposal, as currently written, meet whatever their reasons were for drafting this proposal? And I'd like a response from Shepard before I ask the second question.
Yes, I was going to say, could the Shepherds respond on their consultation with the original author on this?
My understanding of the latest discussions I've had with them is they support this. The plurality standard wasn't what they had in mind originally, but they understand the change and why the change, and they basically support it as written. Well, the latest changes, I haven't heard on them, but those were some minor intent changes, only like 2 or 3 words. But so I will summarize it saying, yeah, I believe they support it as written.
Okay, second question.
Thank you. Second question is, Frank notes the posted on PPML this morning. What if Acme Hosting Inc., located in the Silicon Valley, found a niche offering virtualized servers for Asian customers who want to have their internet-based services hosted more closely to the North American market? Acme Hosting and their infrastructure are clearly in the U.S., but their customers are not in the ARIN region. Does this policy, as currently written, preclude Acme Hosting from requesting more address space as their Asian customer base grows?
John Kern.
Yeah, this actually, I just responded to BPML on this. And the complete answer's there, but the short one is that under the current policy, they may request additional addresses as their customers grow. They're virtualized, their customers purchasing virtualized hosts. Under the revised policy text, we would not consider their customers who are not in region. There's a side effect there, okay? People who are doing hosting with virtualized equipment for customers outside the region have no new customers in region and have no new equipment. And so that side effect would mean that they would not qualify for additional address space. I recommend people think hard about whether or not you wish to have addresses issued to any virtualized things, as they tend to be spun up pretty quickly. And so the constraints of virtualized equipment that's not actually supported by customers is very difficult to administer.
Very correct. Far microphone.
So I'm John Springer, Inland Telephone, ARIN AC. In thinking back on the genesis of this process, the original concern of law enforcement was that they weren't able to put the arm on people, not that the resources were leaving the region. And it's my recollection, and I'll be happy to be corrected, that this whole process of plurality and resources remaining in the region is a sort of an artifact of this development process. I don't like it. In terms of keeping resources within the region, we gave back nearly a /8 a while back. If we were going to be trying to keep resources in region, we might not have done that. I think anybody with a legitimate use for addresses should get them. We should be going to V6.
So you're not in favor as written?
I like to be in support of law enforcement, but like I say, the original concern was being able to get a hold of resource requesters, and they were finding situations where they were fictitious and or had not enough English speaking skills to determine any sort of standing. So I appreciate the amount of work that has gone in on this, and I commend specifically David Farmer for his rigor in this process. We should all take a lesson from his book on developing this process. But no, right now, it needs more work, and I do not like the business about plurality.
Thank you. We'll get a very quick response from David, then go to the...
Plurality was the original text from the authors had majority of a full 50%. Plurality is relaxing that a little bit. I think the feedback I've gotten on the list is that should be relaxed down to a minimum percentage. And the reason for any of those, a majority, a plurality, or a minimum percentage, is to ensure there's some reality to the request, and that that there's some reality to the basis in the region. And so that, because you were right, they're worried about fictitious requests. And so some analysis of the actual request and that there's some basis in reality in the ARIN region is the purpose for majority, plurality, or a minimum percentage.
Can I respond?
Very, very quickly.
again, I believe that the law enforcement is anxious to get their hands on people, and they don't care what the method is, and I suggest that the method that they have suggested might be less valid than some other methods.
Thank you. Center microphone patiently.
Owen DeLong, ARIN AC, Hurricane Electric. Generally support the policy. I do think that it's not quite ready for prime time and needs some work, especially in light of the virtualized comments. I do have a concern though, and that is that a lot of the conversation has centered around how this policy affects the V4 free pool. Correct me if I'm wrong, this is currently a draft, not a recommended draft, correct?
That is correct.
So this policy is unlikely to affect the V4 free pool even if enacted, because it's going to be at least 6 months before it gets to the point of being reviewed at a meeting as a recommended draft, which means 8 to 10 months before implementation. In 8 to 10 months, we are unlikely to have much of an IPv4 free pool based on current trends.
Well, Aaron does not make predictions on such things, but John might have some words of wisdom on that.
I'm looking for Jeff Houston in the audience. There he is.
There's Mr.
Jeff,
Jeff does, however,
Do I
make
have 8 to 10 months or don't I?
Mr. Houston, do you have a prediction by chance?
You have about 16 to 17 months, because
That's
I'm
what I thought.
assuming that IANA is going to hand back its 20 million addresses, so that gives you until January the 3rd, January the 4th, 2015.
Thank you, Oracle Houston.
At 3 o'clock, tea time. Yes.
Thank you, Oracle Houston, for that. Owen, were you finished?
So we have, maybe 6 months after this policy is implemented that there's still some free pool for it to affect. My argument is that's not much of an IPv4 free pool for it to affect. On the other hand, this policy will have significant impact on IPv6 and IPv6 distribution. And with the increasing level of things that are being virtualized, I think that the side effects on virtualization merit very, very serious consideration prior to implementing this policy, and that there is much work to be done, not just at the wordsmithing level, but at the actual intent level before we actually put this forward as a recommended draft and put it into practice, lest we shoot ourselves squarely in the head.
So not supportive of the text, Owen, but supportive of the cause, so to speak.
Yes.
Thank you. Next microphone.
Jason Schiller, Google. I oppose as written. I think there's a lot of confusion with regard to this policy. It's been said a number of times that this policy really doesn't change the ARIN current practice. And then we heard this morning about a use case of a virtual hosting provider offering services to customers that are in Asia, and how under current policy that's allowed and under this proposed policy it would not be allowed. I think there's other use cases where the ARIN practice will change. I think what would be the most effective way to move forward is to talk about a number of use cases, how those use cases are today, and how they will be changed, how you propose they should be changed in the future. I think the origin of this discussion started with the observation that there was an Asian tunnel provider that was providing tunnels to Asian customers, and that they today under ARIN policy are permitted to get addresses because they have 2 tunnel routers in the US and LA. And I think really what we need to do is fundamentally step back and say, do we want to prevent this type of a customer from getting resources from ARIN? Is the community nodding yes, we do, or no,
Right.
we don't? And then I think the next step is to figure out, if you do want to block that use case, how do you block that use case without blocking other use cases?
Without unintended consequences, so to speak.
My big concern is for those networks that are truly global in nature, where they truly have a significant presence in the US, and they truly have a significant presence outside the US. How do those companies continue to operate a global network? And I think the policy as written very negatively impacts them. My understanding today is if there is a global network that is in part in the ARIN service region, and you're using those addresses in that global network that is in part in the ARIN service region, that those are justified. And it's unclear to me if that is still true with this new proposed policy. because I can read it two different ways, and it can be parsed two different ways and mean two different things.
Mr. Curran, and then
So as noted in the staff assessment, this formalizes some things we're already doing with respect. Legal presence is something we've already asked for. Use in the region with respect to routing, we already asked for. And this codifies them. It does make a change to existing practice, which is the part clearly called out in the staff assessment, which is when we ask you for customers or equipment, we will clearly be asking for customers' equipment in the ARIN region. And so a global network will suddenly have to say, what am I supplying that is in the ARIN region if I'm asking for ARIN addresses? So there's very definitely a change in practice because of this text, and what people have to decide is that appropriate or not?
again, I direct you to the discussion guide on page 7 and 8 where the staff assessment details some of that. Did you want to discuss, respond anything on Jason's comment, or?
Not at this time.
Not at this time. Thank you, Jason. Going to go to RS, a remote participant, please.
We have a remote question from Anthony, pardon me, Anthony De La Cruz. What does or would the guidance look like on a U.S.-based company that also has international sites? Since folks assume they are not to be used outside, even though that is permitted, but not explicitly allowed or written allowed or denied.
I'm not sure. One more time, please.
Certainly. What does or would the guidance look like on a U.S.-based company that also has international sites? Since folks assume they are not to be used outside, even though that is permitted, but not explicitly written, allowed, or denied.
So to answer the question, I think I heard, again, this is at the time of request. At the time of request, your international sites would not be counted for purposes of this, nor would international customers, meaning international being outside of ARIN region, because we have 25 economies in our region if you count all the Caribbean ones. But outside of ARIN region, those sites and customers would not be counted. Once you've received addresses, we're unlikely to note how they're actually used. If they're used in a way that clearly doesn't match what you told us, and someone notes that, a fraud report or something, then yes, you could actually be up for resource review and have them taken back. That would be bad. But in general, we're only talking about the allocation of resources.
Thank you. A very quick comment here, and then we're going to try and get through the queue
So,
here.
John, you said they wouldn't be counted, and they need to be counted. It's just that they can't be more than what is in the ARIN region.
Right. To be clear, because of the plurality requirement, or majority, or whatever you end up implementing, they are counted. They're not counted on the positive side of the numerator. Yeah.
Next question from the center mic. I appreciate your patience.
Victor Corsi, Guy. So on the original question, I would probably prefer the plurality being used versus minimum percentage. I would prefer the word plurality used instead of minimum percentage.
Okay.
Because minimum percentage can be, I think there'll be a lot of debate as to how that's computed, how it's calculated, how do you ascertain what size is, and there'll be a lot of unique ways of dictating what it is. And the other quick question is based on kind of what Owen mentioned. I agree that we need to understand the impact of virtualization. I know there seems to be a lot of skirting around that issue, but virtualization is, you're talking about, although it's virtual in nature, it's a real element within the internet system. It actually has a use within the internet system, so it has to be considered within the internet system. Irrespective of how it exists, it does impact the internet system, so we have to consider that. And because how this is going to survive into the V6 world, we have to consider it, in my opinion.
But Victor, for the direction the text is taking, in favor, against?
Supportive in general of the cause, but I think there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that we do the right job here, because this is going to impact a lot of folks for a long time.
Thank you.
Well beyond the V4.
Thank you.
Just to...
Oh, all right. Mr. John, and then...
Just one note that we presently handle people just fine who do virtualization, who manage IP address pools. It's not a problem. But because it's possible to say this customer has 5 servers, 50 servers, 500 servers. We make to make sure things are credible. So if your past record in customer growth and your past use of DSLAMs and how your sign address is, or your Wi-Fi nodes, we know how to average dynamic pools. So it's not that we don't take them into consideration. The point I want to make is that organizations whose business model are highly virtualized, right now, we spend time asking, we just ask for their customers, and we can normalize that to determine what their address demand is. In cases of a company that's highly virtualized where the customers are outside the US, there will be an impact. And so we don't worry about this now. It's not a problem with virtualization per se. It's a problem with adding criteria about what customers are supporting that demand.
Very short, Dave, because
Yeah,
we've got
very
people
short.
about to
The
faint.
intent of the minimum percentage isn't just to put that word in, it would be minimum percentage X, and we need to figure out what X is.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Hello, Donnie Roisman with SoftLayer. I thought I understood the proposal before this discussion began, and now I'm also more confused as to what it is we're trying to do. My understanding, and what I do support is a policy that mandates use, plurality of use within the region. I don't necessarily know that I understand whether or not the organization to which the addresses are assigned, I understand why the organization has to be an organization that exists within the region, an organization registered within one of the ARIN region countries. I think it's perfectly legitimate for a region, for a business, an organization to do their business offshore, outside of the country, but wanting to expand their business into the ARIN region, Canada, United States, etc. So how will this proposed policy affect a business that doesn't necessarily have a registered organization within the ARIN region, but does intend to purchase servers or provide hosting or whatnot on equipment that is located within the ARIN region?
John?
So remember, there's 2 different ways that organization, in the past, so 2 different ways that organization is going to be looked at. In the past, if we didn't count customers and infrastructure, and we weren't looking at the location in the region, then we would look at their growth, like for example, if they were in someone else's data center and using their prefix, that use of IP address builds a track record that we go from. So it is still possible that it doesn't impact them. But the other point to make is that over time, when an organization is moving into, a brand new organization moving into this region, if they have nothing here, then it's slow start, and that's what it's always been. They get an allocation and they grow over time. So unless they're on someone else's infrastructure and they're using their IP addresses, we're going to look at them as a brand new organization with no history. Now, that may be unfortunate, but it's the fact of restricting them to what's in this region.
Does that address your concern?
No, because it sounded like, from what I just picked up over the past 15, 20 minutes, it sounded like what we're talking about was actually precluding an organization. The organization themselves are not registered as a business within the ARIN region from actually receiving ARIN addresses.
Organizations that can operate in the region, legal presence means we need to have them, organizations very quickly set up shell companies. They very quickly set up an incorporation. As long as they're an entity, a legal entity, and then we can provide them IP addresses. We're not talking about changing that. That's existing practice. Existing practice is you have to have a legal presence in the region. We're codifying that in the NRPM, however, by doing this policy. So this doesn't change the practice, but it does make it explicit. We already enforce that because of our own definition of being an RIR set to serve organizations in this service region.
Okay, so my support would be for a policy that mandates that the plurality of use of resources needs to be in the region, but I do not support codifying that the organization receiving the resources must be a legal entity. I think that based on the way the globalization of the internet is working, you don't necessarily have to have a legal organization within, for example, the United States in order to do business on the internet with equipment in the United States using infrastructure service provider type of thing.
Okay. Thank you for that feedback, and others may want to discuss that. Next in queue, again, very patiently.
Mike Joseph, Google. I oppose this policy. as we've seen here, we definitely need to have clarity. There's certainly a lack of information available about what ARIN operational practices are in this area. And we've seen a lot of questions raised this morning. But I would point out that this policy doesn't seek to answer them very well if we've already had, in the course of 20 or 30 minutes, a lot more light shed on what this policy really does. If this policy as written isn't clear enough for us to understand without John's clarifications, it's just not clear enough. Moreover, the policy creates circumstances in which a provider might not be able to get addresses from any RIR. Particularly, imagine the case where one RIR chooses to require the presence of equipment in their region, and another, such as ARIN, chooses to require the presence of customers within their region. In that case, such a provider would not meet the qualifying criteria for either RIR. So I think we should have tried very hard to avoid adopting policies that, under any circumstances, would make it impossible for a provider to acquire resources. And finally, it puts restrictions on the operation of otherwise legal entities within the ARIN region. Imagine a US-based provider who now has to decide whether or not they're going to accept customers outside the US simply because of this policy, and not only has to make that decision, but then has to further track and monitor that utilization. It creates it requires that provider to act with restraint in the form of how they engage in their business activities. And I think that's a really unfortunate practice for ARIN to sort of push forward on their members. So I would oppose this policy. I think that doing something to curtail the hemorrhaging of addresses may be reasonable, but certainly not this as written.
Thank you for your comment. John, very quickly, then we'll take one more at the mic, and then we'll
I just want to respond to a prior speaker, which is with respect to getting addresses from ARIN. In order to execute an agreement with ARIN, you have to be an organization. And you're going to need to execute an agreement to get addresses assigned. So I'm not sure we can go as virtual as one might want. I just want to point that out. The legal team isn't going to sign with a entity it can't confirm.
Thank you, John. Center mic again. You're going to have to, yeah.
ARIN use 6 Connected in this case, a small business owner and service provider over Anycast services in many countries, and I have ARIN resources. Thinking about this in terms of a V6 only world, I'll just ignore V4 for the moment. Thank you. I think the impact of this is unknown. I'm not in support of anything that stifles innovation. Certainly not in support of anything that stifles the growth of virtualized services or Anycast services. And I can think of a number of use cases where this causes significant problems in providing services that are good for the global internet. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Remote participant, please, RS.
Frank Bulk has a comment
in
response to a previous speaker many back. While existing policy doesn't preclude ARIN resource holders from using address resources out of region, ARIN members should know that current practice is for ARIN staff to ask if all the address space will be advertised in region. And from my perspective, that's from Frank's perspective, that's too restrictive. So if the proposed policy as currently drafted does not receive broader support, ARIN staff does need to review their current verbiage, which John has already promised to do. If after review, ARIN staff's current practice does not substantially change, something ought to be done from a policy perspective to line up the ARIN community's perceived policy flexibility with, this does not make any sense, with prefixes with actual staff practice.
Thank you for that comment. Center mic again.
Andrew Sullivan, I work for Dine. I came into this meeting sort of roughly supportive of the general drift of this proposal, with some reservations about details, but I thought we could fix it. And this conversation has actually convinced me that this is a bad policy. We should pursue it.
Sorry, should or should not?
Pursue
Thank
it.
you.
The worry that I have is essentially that it boils down to hard cases making bad law. It seems to me like we've got a lot of edge cases here that this thing is designed to clarify, and what we're going to do is make solid rules that we can't sort of, decide, oh, well, this is an exception case and we need to do something about it. If you wrote a policy such that, and there are a lot of exceptions and it would effectively not be a policy at all, therefore we shouldn't have a policy about this, and instead we should have much clearer staff practices around these things with a sort of idea of how to be flexible in those edge cases, because every single example that's been here at the mic has been, oh, what about this edge case with like somebody who's over there, but actually they've got this thing over here, and also they do the tootsie wootsie on Thursdays. And it seems to me that those are all compelling examples of a problem that if you make this policy that is all encompassing, you're going to end up with a big problem. So I don't support the policy.
Nor do you support pursuing the problem, so to speak?
Not as a policy matter, no.
Thanks. Thank you.
Peter Boscher, I'm representing Internet Systems Consortium. So I'm one of those weird corner cases. We obviously...
You specifically, or?
One of many. Anyway, so we operate f.webservice.net, and we have many allocations from ARIN. And so we deploy those in areas where we can't get local space because of policy. So we would like to, say, expand into Africa, but AFRINIT's policy says you must have a legal entity in that region. So in theory, what we would do is use ARIN space. So under this proposal, I'm not 100% sure is if critical infrastructure is exempted from it, or do we need to be worried about it? Because otherwise, I would be strongly against the proposal as currently stated.
Thank you for that. Quick
I need a
response.
minute to look at that, please.
So here's a minute. I just asked him before you go, I just asked, we are going to have to, I think, wrap this up soon, so we'll close the mics. I'd ask if you wish to make a comment, you either start typing madly into your browser or approach a mic. Next.
Would it be possible to display the policies of the previous, or of the other RARs on this, specifically APNIC and AFRINIC and LACNIC policies? If it's too hard.
Say when.
It's in the staff portion.
Ah.
Right, go past.
It's right there, isn't it?
There.
Thank you. Sorry.
So I actually agree with Dave Huberman here that the question that's being asked is sort of the wrong question. If you look at the RIRs with remaining free pools, you'll see that they have policies that essentially require in-region use of address space. If ARIN does not have a similar policy, that means that people who are currently out of address space, namely folks in the AP region and European region, are going to descend upon ARIN like locusts because they're the only ones with a free pool that is relatively easier to obtain than in the other two regions with address space. That obviously implies that folks within the ARIN region for which that address space was originally allocated will run out of address space sooner than they would otherwise. If people are aware of that, and that's acceptable, then the policy should not move forward in some modified form or another. If people feel that that isn't the intent of the RAR system, then something similar to this policy, maybe not this exact implementation or description, might be worthwhile. Although I do actually note Owen has a very good point in the fact that this may be rearranging deck chairs into fractal patterns, and that's probably not a useful way to spend your time.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Oracle.
Yeah, Jeff Houston, again, staff. So I'm neither for nor against this proposal, but I would note that I'm one of the folk who over many years has had to defend the RIR system. And the one particular venue we would have had to defend it the hardest has actually been in venues where nation states have traditionally done this role. And the argument that we've gone through is that the internet removes barriers. It removes barriers to trade, it removes barriers to activity. It gets rid of a whole bunch of artificial sort of impediments to doing business. And you heard folk doing virtualized services. I put up stuff here, I have customers there, and this is the way it's worked. Why don't we have just one registry? And logically, I suppose, it would be consistent. We just do one. Why do we have these regional registries? We've argued in those spheres that this is all about better service. Service in time zone, service in language. It's about providing folk who need addresses the ability to do so efficiently and quickly, and they can use them wherever they want, because that's the way the internet has worked for them, for us, and for you. Think very carefully about what you're going to do for the next 14 months of V4 and what you're going to have to live with for the rest of your lifetimes and everyone else's. Because if you provide a signal to nation states that addresses are not just regional but national assets, you're going to find it very hard to defend a system that says, well, if you get addresses from this entity, you can only use them in that location. Because nation states say, really? I didn't think it worked like that. But if that's the case, why shouldn't I do it too? And as I said, as someone has had to defend this system in many places, I would actually argue that what Afrinic and Blacknick have done maybe needs a little bit more thought in those venues about what they're trying to achieve. Because in the long run, if what we really want is an internet that removes artificial and insane barriers to activity, to just doing good business on the net, then maybe these kinds of restrictions around addresses make the problem we're trying to solve with the internet so much harder. Whether you've got 12 months left, 14 months left, or 8 months left, or even 3 months left. So what?
Thank you. The microphones are now going to be closed. Jason, you'll be next, but first...
Just to get back to a past request regarding the applicability of the proposed policy text to requesters for critical infrastructure, it would be applicable to requesters for critical infrastructure as written. It's a general guidance regarding people requesting resources, so unless otherwise exempted by revisions to the policy text, it would apply to all requesters for resources.
Okay.
Jason Schiller, Google. So I previously discussed about how concerned I was about the confusion involved in different edge cases and how they currently get space and how they'll be impacted under this new policy. I want to talk about one in particular, and that is the case where you have a global network where there's a significant portion inside the ARIN service region. But they want to do things like have consistent addressing. They want to use the addresses throughout their network. They want all of the loopbacks for all their devices in the US as well as Europe and Asia to come out of one block. They want a number of point-to-point links out of a contiguous range. They want customers to come out of a specific block. Is it the intent of this policy to no longer allow global networks to use ARIN addresses throughout their global network to serve customers and infrastructure in the ARIN region as well as outside the ARIN region? Because my understanding is today, under current ARIN practices, a global network that is in region, part of a company that operates legally in the US, can get addresses that are used in the US as well as outside of their US footprint.
Thank you. Any quick response?
I would say it's not the intent to prevent it. It's the intent to limit the scope of it.
Good.
I think that it was what the plurality clause would be. So there will be some cases where entities will have to get resources from more than one RIR. That's basically what this is saying. But that I would think the vast majority of use cases should be able to fit inside the plurality clause. But
So to be clear on the plurality clause,
yeah.
today, out-of-region use by out-of-region customers on out-of-region equipment that's part of a global network that's in region is counted as utilized.
Correct.
Yep.
Under this proposal, that usage would not count towards plurality.
Correct.
Well, see, this is where John and I disagree a little bit. It's utilized.
Well, I'm going to let you know how that works.
No. It's
As it turns out, you're not the one answering the requester. So the policy proposal as written, if we are looking, as written, it's infrastructure or customers. And so When we look at that, out of region, because of the policy text, would not be counted. It would be counted in your total requests, but it would be not considered favorable for the plurality measurement. And so existing organizations currently using ARIN as their global source of IP would potentially be impacted if their network is predominantly lobed outside the region.
And I would say that, you know, if there is text and staff interprets one way, that is the trump. And if the AC disagrees with interpretation, they should probably clarify it a little bit, would be my suggestion.
What I would say is I disagree with the way he characterized.
Let's Jason first then.
Yeah,
I think it's pretty clear that the text is not clear enough and needs a lot of work.
Yeah.
The other portion that I'm concerned about is where the customer is located. And I don't know how to define that. If I'm a transit provider and I have a T1 that goes to Tempe, Arizona, is that where my customer is? What if the bill gets sent off to the corporate headquarters in Spain? Is my customer in Spain? And this gets even more complicated when there's no physical connection to the customer. If they want to host their server in a colo that's in LA, is my customer in LA because they brought their equipment to LA, even though their home office is in Spain? Or is my customer where the bill gets sent? What if my customer's in Spain, but they set up an office here and have me send the bill here? Is my customer now here in the ARIN region? So I'm not really sure where the customer is, and I think it becomes even more complicated when you look at virtualization and any casting. I mean, how do we deal with a case where my customer wants to provide a service, but they want that service to be in every data center worldwide?
John Kern?
I explained this on the list. We're going to ask you for the customers who have IP addresses assigned to them statically. We're going to ask where that's assigned, what equipment that's on, okay? And that's pretty easy to do. For customers that don't have addresses statically assigned to them and are in a dynamic pool, we ask where that pool is located.
So if I have a T1 static customer, my edge router is in New York, and I statically route the IP space to my customer port in New York, and the far end of that T1 is in London, my customer is in New York because that's where I'm routing the static route to?
It's not having to do, we ask you to give us a customer list, and we ask where those customers are. For most transit providers, those customers are providing us the customer location, the other end of the link. Now, since we don't spend a lot of time worrying about customer locations, okay, because we haven't had to worry about this, it's never come up. We're going to attempt to implement the policy as written, which means if your customer's in London and you say he's in London, we're going to tell you he is not going to count favorably for measuring the plurality.
London, England, I assume, since London,
London,
Ontario, in the ARIN service region.
Yes, London,
in fact,
Ontario.
quite a bit of address-based routes
It's
through there.
wonderful. So if you tell us he's out of region, he is going to be considered out of region.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for that, and with that, and just I'll give RS one last check in case there was any late-breaking remote comments. No, seeing none. I'd like to go to a small public service announcement. You know, I know that you're all busy in email and web surfing, but just for the cost of raising your hand for just a few seconds, you too can give valuable feedback to an AC member. So I'd ask you all now to consider the question of, should the AC continue to work on the policy 2013-6? Obviously, they're going to have to continue to work on the text because I think there's been some consensus on feedback, but the policy itself, should the AC continue to work on that? I think our counters are ready, so I'd ask all those in favor of that, raise their hand high for just a few moments. Nice and high. Okay, you can lower your hands. And all those who do not believe the AC should continue work on this policy, please raise your hands nice and high. Nice and high?
Nice and high.
Just a few seconds is all we ask. Be that edge case.
Between your shoulder and your hand should be a straight line pointing at the ceiling. If it's not, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. You can lower your hands. Just give us a moment for the tabulation.
That's time for break.
Just throw it to break, okay.
If you ask me if I'm in favor of a break, like this, it's not
Thank you, Richard. On the matter of 2013-6, should the AC continue working on this policy? In favor 12, against 16, 84 people in the room remotely. This advice is being provided to the AC. Thank you very much for your participation in this proposal. You're going to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, we are now at that next point of our meeting where we have a break. We're going to have a break outside, refreshment break. It is 30 minutes in length, and then we're going to come back in promptly at 11:30, and we're going to pick up our last policy proposal at that point. So half-hour break, everyone. Thank you.